Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at AxonIQ, Sarah Torrey. Welcome to the first episode of Season 3. In this episode, I spoke with our founder and CTO, Allard Buijze, about adopting event-driven architecture into businesses. We talked about some of the best practices and also some of the challenges along the way. I hope you enjoy this episode, and let's have a listen. Hi, Allard. How are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Can you believe it? This is actually the first episode of our third season. It's like
time
boggles my mind.
flies.
Exactly,
Time flies
especially when you have
fun. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm really excited to start this season with it's not a new topic, but it's something different from what we've talked about in the past. So we have been talking a lot about event-driven architecture and domain-driven design, event sourcing, and all of the wonderfulness that comes with it. And the idea of domain-driven design basically came from paying attention to the business domain, right? We have a business question at hand that we are trying to solve. So these past couple of seasons, we focused a lot on the IT side of things, on the technical part of how to do it and how do you go about it, the design, the architecture, and all of that. Today, though, I want to talk to you a little bit about the actual business side of things and why is event-driven architecture, domain-driven design, microservices is actually good and beneficial for the business. And how would you convince the business side of a company, or for that matter, the CEO or the board of directors, that, hey, this is a fantastic idea. Let's get on board. Let's train our engineers and architects to go this route. I know you have some experience doing
absolutely.
that. Right?
There's some war stories that I can share. Absolutely. Yeah.
I can't wait to hear all about it. So actually, a couple months ago, a few articles were shared with me, a couple of them by Gartner. Actually, you brought them to my attention. And our other colleague, Ben Wilcock, had a couple of articles by Forrester that talked about this very topic. And I found them very interesting. So if you don't mind, let's sort of go through them and talk a little bit about what they're talking about into a bit more detail. And I want to talk about it from your experience and your point of view, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So in one of the articles in Gartner, they talked about the fact that, and this article was actually written in 2017, and they were saying that by 2020, which is a year ago now, for most global enterprise CIOs, using the event-driven IT will be one of their 3 top priorities. And I don't think they foresaw the fact that we were going to get into a horrible global pandemic and things would turn out very differently. But I think all in all, we have come to sort of the same conclusion, right? Because I feel that we're seeing this pattern of using event-driven architecture and domain-driven design in general is more noticeable now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that it's the case? And why is it the case? Why do you think that they foresaw this? Actually, you foresaw this about 6 years before that, didn't you?
Yeah, you could argue that. I could make a good, beautiful story that I saw this happening in 2010, and that's why I started doing that. But that's not entirely accurate. I started building Axon framework at the time because I did see some technical issues with how we solved application development in general.
Right.
And I did see event-driven as a very nice programming model. I was interested in this domain-driven design, and I had a feeling that an event-driven model would get me closer to that domain than the typical state-stored model, which is a very technical approach to a very non-technical problem. So You could say, yeah, it was not foresight that let me build that, but in hindsight, it is the same reasoning that basically led to this happening. But I actually enjoyed reading those papers again. So when a discussion that we had popped up and I shared those articles, I read them again, and it's just good fun to look
Yeah,
back 4 years and. I remember having discussions with actually the Gartner analysts at the time about what I saw happening, and the reason Axonic is founded in 2017 is also because we saw this happening, right? Event driven becoming a very important topic on the agenda, not only of the CEOs of large enterprises, but also smaller companies. And there's so much more happening in let's say the event-driven landscape than just the technology. Even though us, especially in the beginning, we're just
absolutely.
focused on that technology part. But there's definitely more to it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that they mentioned was that it's necessary to use event-driven architecture because if you want to modernize your application portfolios and your systems, this is a really good way to go about it. And uh, you just mentioned that not just for large enterprises, but for small and also sometimes unusual, if you would, technologies that have used event sourcing and event driven architecture. And actually, one of the things that they had mentioned in the article, one of the case studies, was a medical company that
Yeah.
used event sourcing for their imaging. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I think you
For
have
their
some uh, insight
Yeah,
in that.
exactly. It was fun to read that article because they mentioned my very first Axon project in that particular article.
Hmm.
And the big challenge they had is that even though they were a startup, it was this medical system. They had to integrate with an immense number of external systems. So basically, is an electronic patient record. But in any hospital or retirement home or whatsoever, every any environment where care is delivered to patients, there is a large number of systems involved. There's these medication systems that ensure that people get the right medication that does not conflict with other medication. There's administrative systems, financial systems, especially when there's the financial aspects of care is pretty complex, like who pays what and why, um, and so the medical record was primarily focused on the care that was given by the doctors. But when a doctor delivers care, there's a financial aspect. So it had to integrate with all these systems. But it was built as a software as a service, which means that for every client they onboarded, they had to integrate with third-party software, and we have seen at the time the most archaic, obnoxious styles of integration. Right, thank God for the anti-corruption layer by domain-driven design that makes sure whatever external choices are made, we don't have to abide by them. We'll just build a little component. This system ended up with 65
Right.
of these components to integrate with
Wow.
65 different systems. None of these interactions, literally none, had any impact on the core system, which is the core system that they delivered as a SaaS. And that is because the event-driven model is very good, is very flexible. And even if you have a batch model towards an external party, you can still simulate that a series of events only happens twice a day. And so an application that is built to handle things as they happen is flexible enough to also interact with any batch driven application. Whereas the other side is definitely not the case, right? You cannot ask a batch driven application to handle, instead of one large batch a day, to handle 1,000 mini batches per second, right? That's not going to work. So that was really the power of it. Being event driven gives you so much flexibility when integrating with external systems, which also helps the larger enterprises. Although their problem is usually that we have existing systems, we need to renew, but we cannot renew everything. We cannot just say, okay, let's switch off all the systems that we had and build something new from the ground up. There's simply no way. So you need to build something new while older applications are running, and that event-driven model gives you a lot of flexibility to connect to the current state of those systems and update it as events happen, etc. So that's a very it's a very powerful model, especially when you need to renew parts of a system. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, what you mentioned right now reminded me of a couple of the things that they talked about in another article that was published by Forrester. And they were talking about the mistakes and also the best practices of using event-driven architecture. And one of the mistakes that they were talking about was over-rotating and making events your domain programming model to the exclusion of others, right? What example that you just mentioned about this medical technology and having it communicate with other services that maybe we're not necessarily using the same technology or same event-driven architecture is actually very interesting. And I was reading that and thinking that, okay, so that's great to use event sourcing, right? That's great to use event-driven architecture, but that's not the only technology that maybe you want to use. Maybe you want to extend it. Maybe you have some other monolithic systems that your application has to communicate with. And then we're coming to the sort of conversation about messaging and how to handle these messages and APIs and so forth. And one of the other mistakes that they were talking about was equating events with a single technology like Kafka, for instance, and using that as your only way of handling your messages. And in their better practices, they were talking about this and how you can maybe remedy this by using other systems. So tell me a little bit about that. Tell me, maybe you have, I'm sure you have other examples that you can think of.
Yeah, and actually, Gartner also mentions it in several articles that basically there's two things going on in this over rotation, right? So one of the problems is we over rotate on technology. So we hear event driven, so we're given a tool. Basically, we're given a hammer, and now everything looks like a nail. So everything that we see, we just want to use that hammer for. And there's always this battle going on, like, okay, we've got different technologies that are good at something, but we don't want too many technologies. So if we can find one technology that can do multiple things, let's use that, with the risk that we use it for too many things, right? And that's the over rotation that they warn about. And it has to do with the fact that first of all, we equate certain technologies, and Kafka is an example of that, with events. So as soon as we hear events, we look at that technology. There are so many more technologies out there that deal with events in different ways that we need to be really careful and conscious about why we pick a certain tool for this particular type of events. IoT events, for example, are very different from business events in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But then the other problem is the over-rotating on events itself. So as soon as we see event, and the word event-driven architecture does not really help. It tells us events drive this architecture. No. And there's a talk I started doing in 2014, I think, and I'm still asked to do that talk at conferences, which is that the messaging is essentially not only events, right? Messaging is not the same as doing events. In Axon, you can clearly see that we like commands and queries as much as events, and they're just different communication style. It's not so much about the fact that you need to be a command or a query or an event, but Gartner, for example, also warns that don't use event-driven all over the place. There's still a case within event-driven systems for what they call remote procedure calls, essentially request-reply communication. In our case, we distinguish between commands and events in that style of communication because, there's optimization differences, and it's also more clear do you expect another system to do something for you, or are you just asking a question? Right? There are significant differences, but they are both request-reply style communication. And we've noticed that if you are aware of that and don't see event-driven and message-driven as the same thing, and I think there's more power in message-driven than in event-driven, that you build better systems. But still, there's something special about events, so I'm not going to start a fight against the term event-driven, because there is something more to events than the other types of messages. Still, right? There's because event-driven, when it comes to technology, we have to be message-driven. But when we are about on the business level, we need to be very conscious of all the events that are happening there. So event-driven. I like event-driven systems, but I think the architecture itself should be event-driven, message-driven. Sorry.
Absolutely. So going back to, I love that you mentioned the businesses again. So going back to really looking at not the technology itself, but the more high-level business side of it. One of the things that Gartner was also mentioning about the benefits of using this type of designing the systems is that it can actually give businesses a rapid growth, because we are enabling digital business transformation. And they're also mentioning the capitalizing business moments and agility. And how are we, though, using this sort of architecture, this sort of design to modernize the system? So obviously we're talking about smaller batches, maybe doing things at a more rapid pace. We're not deploying things once a year, right? You have smaller bites that you can take. But can you give me a little bit more examples or benefits of
context? Yeah. So one of the things that these papers
context, yes,
exactly. So one of the things these papers mention is that events give you situational awareness, and that's a very important aspect, right? To do great business, you need to be aware of your surroundings. You need to know what happens and then respond to what happens in that in such an environment accordingly. So the opposite of an event-driven business is a batch-oriented business. One example of that is payrolling, right? Payrolling is typically something that happens. You do your payroll batch, your monthly batch, or your weekly whatsoever. So there's very little situational awareness. But I'm pretty sure we can imagine a more event-driven payrolling, like, hey, I need to pay my bill. Okay, here's your salary right now. That would be an interesting thought experiment. But if we translate that to businesses, then if you have events, like an event is basically something that happens naturally, right? In businesses, people work, and as people work, things happen. We have customers, they interact with the business, and as they interact, things happen. And it's about being able to capture the things that happen and process them, preferably in real time within your system. Because the closer you are to real time, the better the picture you can create around what is going on right now at the moment, and generate new behavior out of that. And there's one example, and I've used it a couple of times, which is there's a presentation from Toyota, which is on our YouTube channel as well. And the presentation has a technical part and a non-technical part, right? And we'll leave the technical part for what it is, but the non-technical part drives some interesting information, which is around when you purchase a car. There's a big level of excitement within customers, right? You're buying a car that is one of the bigger deals you do in life. It's not as big as a house, but you don't buy that many cars in your life. At least most people don't. But then when you've bought your car, until the time of delivery, there's a huge gap. And there's a massive disappointment gap, right? It is silent. So you go from this high level of excitement to nothing. And then suddenly a month or 2 months later or something, your car arrives, and now you're going back into excitement mode. And at Toyota, they were sensing that they could, capitalize, but not in a capitalistic way, but they could do something with that moment of the brand association is completely gone. People don't feel happy about their Toyota at that moment, right? So what they decided to do is, instead of sending a monthly newsletter to those people that have bought a car and say, hey, are you excited as well? No, I'm not, right? So they didn't read those emails. Their open rate was less than 1%. And they changed that to an event-driven model. And this is just the marketing side of a production organization, right? And they, instead of sending a monthly newsletter, they decided to send you an email when your car was at a specific stage in the factory. And I've heard stories, I don't know if they actually did that, but they had some ideas of taking a picture of your car as the robots were assembling it, right? And that made it very personal. So they started sending out emails about the production of your car, like, hey, it's being produced in that factory right now. And oh yeah, here's some other information that you might be interested in. And suddenly the open rate was several dozens of percents. So people were engaged, and they actually got upsell from that, because you can still buy the air conditioning now. We can still fit it in while we're building your car, right? And I think that is a great example of what event-driven means on a business level. We're not talking about technology here. We're just talking about responding to moments where a customer, or there's a customer interaction, or there's an interaction within a business that is relevant to the customer, and engaging with that customer right away. That drives so much more value.
Absolutely. And I think what you mentioned is really valuable to note in businesses, because they also talk about this, the customer engagement, and what, as you mentioned, why it's so critical. And they even talk about the fact that we want to have more empathetic customer and employee services, right? And this allows us to really experience that. And what you mentioned about the car factory, and your car is being ordered, and now it's at this station, and this is at this level. I actually personally experienced that, not with Toyota, but with another company, as I was purchasing a car a couple of months ago, and it was not here in their inventory, and they had to order it, and it took, like you said, it took several weeks, and there were a lot of downtimes, and there were a lot of times for us to feel like, oh great, how much longer are we waiting for this car to arrive, or is it going to ever get here, or what stage are we at? And every once in a while we get text messages about, hey, your car is at like so-and-so port, or it's at this stage, it's on the ship, or what have you. And when you see that, it, as you mentioned, it gets you excited. It gets you feel like, yeah, okay, we're getting to the finish line. And it's a really good experience for the customer, as a person who is spending money on this car, and you want to see results. And that's really valuable. Another example I thought about was that I don't know if it's exactly relevant, but we had a subscription with the local zoo a couple of years back. And when we went to purchase this, the annual pass, we weren't purchasing it, say, on January 1st. We were getting it middle of the year, sometime in June or July. When we went there, they said, okay, so this is what the annual pass costs for everybody. And we said, okay, sure. This is the money for the pass, and how long is it going to be? Oh, it renews every January. So for me as a customer, I felt like, oh, wait a minute, I'm paying for the entire year, but I'm only getting half of the year.
Exactly.
Anyways, the amount wasn't as much that I wanted to argue about it. Now, fast forward a couple of years, because we were out of country, and then we came back, and I wanted to take the kids to the zoo again. And I had the same idea. I was like, oh, great. Now it's June, July again. We're going to get this pass and pay for the whole year, and it's going to renew again in January. To my great surprise and pleasure, we went there, and they said, no, actually, the system has changed. So it renews on the date that you purchased. So now it's more personalized. It's based on what date I purchased this annual pass. So it renews again next June. It renews on the same day that I bought it. And it was fabulous as an experience, as a customer experiencing this. I said, this is good. We're
exactly. But if you look at what you need to do as an organization in those two examples, there's also a big difference. So in the case of the zoo, they can still. I mean, the first situation that you had a few years ago is obviously batch oriented, right? On January 1st, we run our batch to expire
Okay.
all of the
Exactly.
certificates. But basically, they don't need to do anything because they could just set an expiry date on the card, right? But
Yeah.
if you look at the car example, it is interesting to look under the bonnet to, sorry, pun intended, to to see what an organization needs to do to be able to do that, right? So if you are a batch-oriented system, you'll just have people at different ports, and they'll just see a car coming, and they know, okay, this car needs to go there. They'll just do that job. That's it. There is no interaction or event-drivenness. Well, it's event-driven for that person, but the systems aren't, right? It's just, okay, I'm going to enter this car, and it's now on that truck on its next, on its next.
It's just a notification.
Exactly. But if you start building these systems as being event-driven, like, okay, now this happened, and we are going to publish that into the organization. And this is a very important part where the maturity of event-driven organizations is relevant. Instead of having these incidental events, you need to have events all over the place, because you cannot create situational awareness unless you have all events from around you coming in, and you can build a picture of what's happening. So as soon as a car arrives at a specific port and is put on a train for the next to get to your dealership or at least a bit closer, then the fact that happens has to go into the organization, and then the organization has to be ready to process that in different ways. And events leads are very very powerful at that, because you can do a lot of different things with events. There's no a request reply style communication is really point to point, right? You're just pointing your finger at somebody, and that somebody can do something with the information, and the rest can't. Whereas events is more broadcast. So it allows you to create that situational awareness. And apparently there is a marketing organization or maybe post-sales services organization that says, hey, we can use that information from the port to inform our customers of where their car is. Because, well, as I said, and as you experienced, buying a car after the buying part is a boring moment, right? And there's a lot to win. And that's where events are a very powerful means.
Not just boring, it's frustrating. Because, well, if you live in, if you, for example, you live in the States or you live somewhere rural that you absolutely need your car for your basic day-to-day work, transportation, just, basic living, it's a little bit frustrating. But yeah, I actually wanted to ask you this. So I remember up until, I don't know, a couple of years ago, there were a lot of times that when you would go on a website and if it was nighttime or even your daytime, but maybe the company's nighttime, wherever they were, you would experience a lot of these downtimes. For instance, you would go to a site and it would say, we're doing maintenance right now. The site is down for like 3-4 hours. And I've noticed that happening a lot less in the past few years. Does that have anything to do with kind of going this direction of microservices and event-driven architecture?
I would say indirectly, probably. I think it does have something to do with it. It's the same. I think there are some of the same forces that drive both, but I don't think they are directly connected, but rather indirectly. But it has to do with the fact that to compete, you really have to compete these days, right? If you're in a business and you've been doing the same business for 100 years, big chance some new startup is going to eat you. They will do something in such a more interesting way that they'll just capture all of your customers, right? You really have to be. I mean, even in banking, you see it where people are a bit less eager to go to one of the newer banks, because a lot of people just have a good relationship with their bank. But even there, you see that these new banks are thinking of new ways to deliver products. Absolutely. And now you cannot imagine doing banking anywhere else than on your phone, right? I do even the banking of AxonIQ. I do that on my phone.
Right.
And it has to do with IT not being a cost center. Oh yeah, we also need a homepage kind of thing, or we need to maintain the internal systems. No, IT is now the first thing the first interaction with our customers is through software systems. And that is a very important driving force that, first of all, led to we should have less downtime, because downtime means loss of business. It's as simple as that.
Right.
But the other force is for this event-driven approach, which is to lead better and more relevant services to our customers. So you can deliver a service, but if you deliver it at a time where it's not relevant, there's no point to it.
Yeah.
So it has to be when... So one example, for example, is 50 years ago, you would get a newspaper. And so once a day, you would have yesterday's news. Right. Today, newspapers are, well, they still exist. There's still people that love the smell of paper, but you buy it for the smell, not for the news.
I do.
But if you...
It's that nostalgic feeling, right?
Exactly. And it's the same. You have a relationship with your bank and with your paper. But if you want to get the actual valuable news, you go online, because that's where you read things. And that is also our event-driven mindset. And humans are event-driven, right? We react. We don't do batches. We don't say, oh yes, we do groceries once a week, twice a week, whatever. That's still batch-oriented. But most of the things we do...
That's starting to change too, I feel.
As well, yeah.
COVID especially, right?
Absolutely. We have much more like delivery and even there.
Yeah.
So nothing is set in stone. Things will change. But
right.
The news that we gather is already much more event-driven. We want to hear about the news as it happens. And right now there's a very unfortunate event going on. There's a massive floods in the... southeast of the Netherlands. Fortunately, I live in the west, but in our country, and there's you can imagine if you read something and you can watch the images of something that is happening right now live, it has a much bigger impact than when you hear, oh yeah, last month there was a flood and here's an article about it. Then the feeling and the association and the way you value what's going on is different. Now this is a negative example, but in businesses you can have the exact same examples where if you sell an iPhone 11 nowadays, it's like, so what, right? No, we want them as they happen. That's when the relevance is there. That's when you get the excitement and the biggest value, and that happens for large purchases, but definitely also for the small ones.
And that's really funny that you actually mentioned the importance of news and as it's happening. And we are so aware these days. And sometimes I feel like overly aware of these things. And this morning, actually, I was walking in the kitchen and my dad always reads his news on his phone. And he gets them from all sorts of different sources. And he was telling me, oh, yeah, what you mentioned also is happening in west side of Germany with the flooding. I said, yeah, did you know there's flooding in Germany? I said, oh, yeah, I was assuming because I just spoke to my friends in Germany who live in that region yesterday, and they were telling me there's a lot of rain. So that's not surprising. For him, it was news. It was something that he didn't know about. For me, that news came through Twitter a lot faster. So I didn't even have to go to a news channel per se to find out about this. I just figured it out from other ways. So
exactly.
It's fascinating how these things are changing and how our worlds are changing. And especially during COVID, the example that you said about the grocery shopping, we did most of our grocery shopping online, and it was once a week, sort of batch style, get everything that we need. But we also did a lot of daily purchases through other startups that had come up with these smaller transactional grocery stores that you would get you run out of milk, you get your milk in 10 minutes. It was insane. It was fascinating. It's like, oh, we didn't have this, 2 years ago even, or last year we didn't have it.
There's an event in your household, which is...
Yeah.
There's an event in your household, which is that they're out of milk. That's a negative event, and you want to respond to that. And when is the relevant moment to get milk? It is 10 minutes from now, not next week when we do the next batch of groceries, right?
Right, exactly. And it was what you said about the systems and the customer satisfaction and this customer relationship that you're providing with this sort of event-driven system is that while that milk was being delivered to my home, I was getting real-time updates. This, you had a map with the bicycle on it. It was showing you where this bicycle was, like how long it's going to take to get to your house, and it was to the dot. It was so amazing. It was just to the dot. You'd see the bicycle come to your house, and my kids would jump behind the window. Groceries are here! And it was like the most exciting event of their day. It's just really amazing customer experience.
Well,
yeah.
But there's another thing you mentioned earlier with the overflow of information, because I think that's also a relevant or a problematic feature of event driven, which is also going back to the over rotation, also part of it. So one of the challenges that we're going to have is, and we see that when reading the news, there's so much news that you have to know what you care and what you care about, and some of the news, or in a business environment, the events that may occur. You have to be careful to only include those events that really contribute to your situational awareness, because you can easily use everything, which has a danger of misinterpretation. So what if you get an event, oh, the car is in that port? You need to know what it really means. All right, it doesn't mean it's available, it's in the country now. No, it still has to go through customs, and still something can happen. It can still get damaged somehow, etc., etc. So you have to be very much aware of what these events mean, and they might not always be described in a language that is yours, right? So that ubiquitous language and bounded context concept from domain-driven design comes into play as well. So especially when as we go more event-driven, especially in the enterprises, you have to be very careful to use the right events at the right moments, not to get those misunderstandings. And it's easy to get lost as well.
Exactly.
So that's
and there is so many things that I want to talk about when it comes to that. When it comes to that personalized experience, and especially getting your news, getting your information, and what's actually important. Because one of the things that was the hot topic with this previous U.S. election, and also the previous one out before that, not to get too political, but it was the fact that how you were receiving your news and what was your quote unquote personalized news, and how it was presented to you based on the information that you had presented to the news service that you were using, for instance, or your social media or your contacts. And it's fascinating seeing things changing in such a rapid way. And I don't know for sure if they're using event-driven systems to get this sort of real-time information from people and then give it back to us as the consumers. But I can imagine that at some level it is being used, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it has to be, it's gotta be event-driven in some way. Yeah. But at least the ingredients of building context and building a situation around, okay, what is interesting for you? What is the kind of thing you want to hear? And there's pros and cons about this particular example, because you only get news that you want to hear, not the news that you need to hear to get a good understanding.
Right, not the entire picture.
So you don't get a 360-degree view. You only get the 180 that you seem to care about. So you have to be a bit careful there.
Exactly, it was a big controversy. Yeah, and that was a big controversy because you, as a person who is going to vote, for instance, you want to have what they would call all of the information. But it's really difficult to get all of that information in sort of a neutral way, in a way that you can actually go and make your decision. Because if the information presented to you comes sort of in a package that's more interesting to you, based on your interests, as you have put in your search results or what have you, then that news is really catered to you, and that result is catered to you, and not necessarily to your neighbor, for instance. Your neighbor might get a different version of the news, for instance. But that's a huge topic that we're not going to get into right now. But I do want to talk about something that you mentioned earlier, which was the mindset. And one of our colleagues, Sarah Pellegrini, had a talk a couple of months ago, or last month, I think, was it at DDD Exchange, about this particular thing, which is changing the mindset. And why is it important to change the mindset of not your IT department, for example, your engineers, your architects, your designers, but also the mindset of the business side. You have an experience, I'm sure, having started your own company and also being a CTO of another company previously. How did you get the management on board that, hey, this is a good route, this is the path that we should take?
Yeah. So it actually has to start with them, right? Otherwise, I mean,
otherwise there's no funding for
exactly.
anything
I mean,
else.
there has to be business purpose for it, and yes, you
Exactly.
can, and that is a big danger that has been going on for a little bit already. Is development teams that went event driven, and that's really great. But then you land a little piece of event driven in an organization that's not. Now, on a technical level, that will work fine because I said earlier, there's lots of integration options and it will work. You will get that event-driven part to work, but it will not drive value, right? It will not give you the business value that really, well, you just get less bang for your buck. I mean, there's not much more I can say about that. But when you take event-driven from in the entire organization, so not just the technical stuff, but also in the way software is designed and also in the way it interacts with other components, and then it integrates in an event-driven way with other systems, making it a broader implementation. That's where you get the real value of event-driven, and that's where customers' experiences are impacted as well. So in the Toyota example that I mentioned, it was the idea of marketing to do that, but they used the events from the factory. So they needed the events from that part. But if they didn't have an event-driven approach there, it was pointless. You would still have a batch information from the factory, and then once a month you can say, yeah, somewhere last month we started producing your car. Well, that's not relevant anymore, right? So it has to go through the entire organization. You have to make sure that the events as they happen in your business are reflected in your software. So it brings a very tight cooperation between IT and business, and this is something we've seen at Axonic a lot in our customers, that becoming event driven forces developers to understand what's going on in the business. It brings them closer together, and that way the business starts to see the advantage of event driven and gets alignment. If this is brought from a CTO, CIO, and we see that more and more as Gartner predicted, or maybe even because Gartner predicted, then it gets more, it gets higher on the agenda. That this is something we need to do. So at least for the next systems that we're going to build or rebuild or change, we're going to go for a system that is either built or purchased and allows an event-driven model. That at least we can subscribe to things as they happen that can notify us. Because that's the only relevant moment that we have to react on it. But it starts with having a vision of how can we improve our services to the customer. And giving banks as an example, why is there so many new startups? Because they see new ways. The grocery stores, right? They see new ways of getting groceries to people, and that starts with a vision. And it has to come from C-level. Otherwise, a vision will not get very far.
And in one of the talks that I had with another guest, Andy Whitaker, and he actually has a case study, and he did a talk for us last year at our conference, which was the process of him basically convincing the government, because at the time he worked for the state of Indiana, to actually get on board with what his vision was, which was basically driving the organization and their IT systems into a more event sourcing and event-driven architecture. And his story is so fascinating because, as we know, I think in all countries, governments are very slow at changing their ways and at accepting big leaps into becoming more modernized and more advanced. And his case was very, very interesting because they showed by practically how they could shorten this amount of time for delivering a result from maybe taking a year to taking just a couple of months. And they had used Axon framework for their systems, and it's a really fascinating experience and talk. I highly recommend folks to listen to it. But in order to do that, in order to get the business side on board, we also have to talk about a little bit of the cultural practices that have to happen within organizations. And I've had several talks with other guests, such as Kenny and his colleague Evelyn, as well as Rebecca Wurzbrox, about the language, the culture, the amount of conflicts that can happen when you're changing your systems, the patterns that you're using, your personal beliefs, heuristics, and all of that. And I think that's also really important to pay attention to, because anytime you want to make a change in an organization, as I'm sure you have much more experience than I would in this case, that you do have to overcome some, how do I put it? Some bumps on the
bumps,
road, right?
absolutely.
Roadblocks.
I mean, I've done consultancy gigs, or what do you call them, where I talked to a bunch of technical folks, and they loved event driven, and then you got them really excited, and then you leave, and then they implement it and only get halfway. And because halfway there's the business, and then the new requirements come in, and they are described in a very batchful approach, let's say, or state-driven approach, right? And that's very, very common, because we technical folks have to blame ourselves for that, because we have been educating them to write their stories like that, because we build stuff on top of databases. Right, we've been doing that since the 70s, 80s, maybe even before. And so they've adapted their way of investigating what to build that way. But now we are getting much more, with event-driven systems, we get much more closer to how things actually happen in a business. And that also means that business analysts, or whatever they're called, requirements analysts, etc., they also need to change the way in how they describe software. Otherwise, developers are just on their island. So we have to get off that island. Somebody has to leave it. Otherwise, we can't get together. And I think everybody has to leave their little island and start working together. And it brings people really closer together.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the really interesting things about what we what I came across last year, which was the concept of modeling your events, event modeling and event storming, because those concepts really bring the entire organization in the same room in a way, and allows different departments and different parts of the organization to come together and make a decision for where you want your systems to basically go, where you want your business to go. Because as we talked about earlier, domain-driven design is really based on business domain. We're not talking about any other domain. And that's why we want to have everybody in that same room basically discussing it. And of course, there are times that there are conflicts, and that's where consultants come in handy, and they can sort of smooth these bumps and pave the road a little bit. But what is interesting also that you mentioned about ubiquitous language also is that you have to have this kind of same language within different organizations so that everybody's on board. Now, not necessarily, you don't have to have all of the technical languages within different IT teams handed over to the business side, or vice versa, and you're all like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But there has to be some sort of common language so that we can all be sort of on the same level and grow together.
Yeah, that's something that event storming and event modeling as well, to some extent, they achieve very well, because they both start with modeling based on events. But there's another aspect that's really important and powerful is, I remember having design sessions, and you would ask a fellow architect, and you would have an argument, or you would decide on which is the best way to implement something, right? Which is the more powerful way. But that's an argument, right? You can talk, and you basically you can claim why a certain solution is better. But what both event storming and event modeling do, even though they're very distinct strategies or distinct approaches, they both start with events. And events, you cannot argue about them.
Because they've happened.
Right? Something either happens or
History.
It doesn't. It's really that simple, right? There's no so it's more about discovery. And this is what they would call emergent design. Right? It's not a design that is created because two humans had a fight about what's best and the big mouth won, so we take that approach. But rather, no, we've talked and we did a discovery with a group of people that knows what's actually happening in the business. There were some technical folks. Alberto Brondolini always says you need two types of people in your sessions: people with questions and people with answers. IT people are the people with the questions this time. We're not the one with the answer. We want to start understanding what happens in the business so that we can build a system to support that. And not the other way around. It has been the other way around for too long, where people would have to, or we would have all the answers. We know what we need. We need a database with a little layer of software on top so that we can store everything. And then we provide that data and you figure out what you want to do with it. No, it's the other way around. We need to understand the business and work that way. And what you'll find is that describing some business process in terms of things that happen, in other words, events, is so much more natural. And then why not take the next step and do the actual implementation of the system according to that strategy as well? You'll find, and this is something that some of our customers will definitely reinforce, is that it is such a natural approach. You just ease into it. And yes, the first time it's a bit awkward, but once you've done it, you will not want to go back to the old style of translation to state driven. That happened. Yeah, then there's a little flag in the database now. That means it happened, right? No, if it happened, just store the fact that it happened, right? And have that flow through the system.
And one of the things that Forrester actually mentioned about the best practices of using event-driven architecture in businesses was that to look at it as a future strategic move and not as your first step. And what you mentioned was very sort of, I think, related to that same point, because we don't want to basically wipe everything out from what you've already done in the business in terms of both the business side and also the IT side. If you have a monolithic system, for instance, you don't want to go demolish that and start everything from the beginning. And that's one of the things that we usually recommend too when we do trainings. We always say, well, start with a monolithic system and then build on that. And then when the need arises, then you can extract from your monolith and make it into more microservices and then basically grow that way.
But there's a big difference between one monolith and another. And most monoliths that we've built are built in a very, let's say, request-response style communication, very tightly coupled. And I think the way we suggest people to, or recommend people to implement systems includes that message-driven approach with very clear messaging between components. And then it doesn't really matter how you deploy these components. So they can still be monoliths, because there's advantages to monoliths over microservices. And in the end, again, taking it from looking at it from a business perspective, we want to provide a certain amount of value, and we want to get that value to the market as quickly as we can. And a lot of our issues around microservices arise from the fact that we're so, well, let's use the word over-rotating again, over-rotating on microservices. I've literally heard people say, I don't know what my next project is, but it's going to run on Kubernetes.
Oh,
that doesn't make sense, right? You can only really know what you want to build once you know what you're being asked for. So if you can deliver that with a monolith, that is so much simpler to do and so much faster. So get to market first. But what you really don't want to do is go so fast that you paint yourself in a corner. And that is the unfortunate reality of a lot of monolithic deployments that, especially in the layered architecture style, they get soldered onto each other, right? And soldered onto each other. So it becomes hard to decompose it later on. But you can, and it's not difficult to do using the right technology. To build these modular monoliths. Some people from SpringSource, Oliver Droodboom, he calls it moduliths. And I like that term, right? It's modular monoliths. It's still monolithic. Monoliths aren't bad things, but we've built bad monoliths in the past, and we have that association. But you can build event-driven monoliths. That gives you the advantage of short time to market, but still the possibility later on to adapt and scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we always emphasize on, which is designing your monolith, but with really good APIs.
Exactly. It starts with APIs, but it never ends there, right? You can
never ends there. Absolutely. And so we talked about most of the things that I had, and then some, because I had some questions pop up later on. But I did want to ask you, we earlier talked about using single technologies. And a lot of times when people think about, for instance, message-driven architecture, they think about Kafka. That would be the first thing that may pop up in their head. But that's not the only technology you should be using, preferably, right? Because other needs may arise that Kafka may not be able to cater to those needs. Are there other technologies that you can recommend? Do we have a solution? Is there a mother of all technologies that we can use?
Yeah, it would be nice to have this one solution fits all. No, I would always start with the conceptual side first. So what I've learned in the last 10 years is focusing on the messaging between components and the thinking about, is it really an event that I'm submitting or that I'm emitting, or am I asking a particular question? Am I expecting a response? Like if you're emitting an event and expecting a response, it's one of these. Well, I always joke that event-driven can't be everything, and you can try this at home. There's a little experiment that you can do at home. Now, go into the living room, and everything you say is in past tense and contains one noun and a verb.
Right.
So if you're, you can ask. So I could ask my wife, could you, if she's in the kitchen, could you bring me a drink from the fridge if you're coming this way, right? That would be a friendly way to ask for something. An event-driven way would be, I am thirsty. I'm pretty sure that
that's not going to get you any drinks.
Environment at home would become awkward. It will not get me anything, right? So in systems it will work the same way. It will just get awkward, and then it's like, oh yeah, this system is shouting something and hoping for a response. Where does that response come from, and what happens if it doesn't, etc. So it is better in that case to be explicit in the type of messaging that you expect. And this is a very strong recommendation that I give. Start with that. Start thinking about what is the ideal form of messaging. Yeah. And then technology comes second. And Kafka is really good at processing events. It's not a command bus. It's not a query bus. It's an event streaming platform, and there's a lot of power that it brings in terms of processing and all of that. But it is not the only thing we need. We still need databases to ask our questions, to give us information. That situational awareness cannot be an event stream, right? Yep. If you're going shopping, let's take the shopping example again. You want to know what your balance is on your bank account. Yep. To know whether you can or should buy a particular range of products.
2 extra boxes of chocolate, you mean?
So you want situational awareness. Exactly. Do I buy the whole box or just one? So you need that situational awareness. Do you get situational awareness from looking at all of the bank statements of last month? No, that's the event stream. Right. But in this case, you don't want the entire event stream. You need a specific value. You need a specific, what we call projection of those events, which is my current balance. That's the information I need. So we also need to include good old school database technology to give us that instant situational awareness. So that's some parts that I would that always need to be included. Starting with the messaging, like, okay, I have a question. A component has a question. That's great. Ask another component to build you that situational awareness in an efficient way. Obviously, what we do at Axonic is really focused on that. So we're building this software that supports these different styles of messages. Is that a full replacement of Kafka? Yeah. Absolutely not. Right? We've had some people say, yeah, we're debating whether we should use Axon or Kafka. And then the thing is, actually, that means you don't really understand the problem you're solving yet. So let us help you with that. And let's see what kind of problem you have. Do you have an event streaming problem? Then an event processing and all of that, then it's Kafka. But if you have a messaging and you need components to communicate through these commands and different commands, events, and queries, these different types of messages, that in that case, well, Axon could do
a lot of magic.
Can mean more for you in that. Yeah, exactly.
And the very last thing I wanted to ask you, in that same Forrester article that they were talking about the best practices, one of the final points that they're making was that use the quality of service and context to determine whether an event source or sync. So we did talk a bit about this, but can you give me maybe a short example of, would this be, how could we ensure that an event really doesn't sync? Is it going back to the design again?
Well, yeah, this is about the direction of communication, I think I would. I don't have the full context of where this sentence came from. It's always a bit, the communication style in those articles is often quite
abstract.
Let's say fluffy. Sometimes abstract, yeah. But quality of service has always been a challenge in messaging, right? There's this joke that there's two problems in messaging. Problem number two is single message delivery or single delivery. Exactly once delivery. Problem number one is message ordering, and problem number two is exactly once delivery. Right. So but those problems are less of an issue nowadays because the style of communication that we use. So both Kafka and Axon, by the way, use the same style, which is more of a store and forward. So you build an event stream rather than a queue-based system where you take a message off the queue. You now store them in, you could still call it a queue, but we store it in a stream. And you consume messages in that stream at your own pace. You're not dependent on others taking messages off and then failing to handle it. Now they have to put it back, but maybe putting it back fails. So now you've lost a message, right? And those problems have been addressed pretty well. So it is something to become aware of, to be aware of. But there is already a range of technologies that you can use that don't have that problem. So I'm not sure if that is exactly what they're alluding to in the articles. But you have to be aware of that problem and make sure that there are some delivery guarantees that we have, and we need to choose a technology
to address it.
And I guess again it comes down to understanding your problem and then choosing a technology to help you solve it.
Exactly. Fantastic. Wow. We covered a lot, which is awesome. It's always really nice talking to you, Allard, because I, of course, have questions ahead of time, but then talking to you just brings up more questions and more topics to talk about. And you magically address all of them. Well, not magically, but skillfully, I should say, address all of them in a very, very practical way, which is fantastic. So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today, and I wish you a fantastic rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me again, and good luck with the rest of your third season.
Thank you so much. I hope to have you back again. Until then, have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed my talk with Allard. Please join me next time as I talk about other fascinating and important topics. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!